Well, the brains are back. Joel Connelly, the PI, Chuck Taylor, the Weekly, right here on Public Exposure. I'm Stan Emmert, and it's been 5 weeks since they've been with us, and I don't know about you guys, but I've missed them. Joel and Chuck, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Tremendous, tremendous article in the Weekly entitled "A Waterfront Brawl." Chuck, I got to ask you, are there big changes in store at the Port of Seattle?
I don't know. The story we ran basically was based on emails and some other information that suggests that Mick Dinsmore, the CEO of the port, who's the hired official who basically runs the thing, got involved in recruiting candidates and possibly strategizing during the past election. And there was a lot at stake in that election because the port, there were some reformers who were trying to get on. There was a reformer who wanted to stay on, and it was somewhat of a turning point that could have led to Dinsmore's loss of a job at some point, possibly. The reformers don't like the way the port's being run, and so at any rate, the emails suggest that Dinsmore was conversing with people on the political side about recruiting people to run for seats or strategizing.
Yeah. Joel, you've been one who's covered the port pretty closely, a lot more closely than others here in this area, and I think you've complained here on the show about how perhaps that those in the media don't look at the port closely enough. What are the reformers that Chuck's talking about, what do they want to do?
First of all, I think they want to speed Mr. Dinsmore's trip into retirement. Secondly, want to basically, how do I put this in very general terms, just question the way things have always been done at the port, which is obviously a very, very self-protective bureaucracy that is deeply into its own routines. The port has done some things very well. I think Mr. Dinsmore has been a spokesman on port security nationally, wrote a very influential article for the Washington Post on how we are neglecting this area. I think finally some of the mitigation that's being done on the third runway down at SeaTac, they need to be applauded for. But at the same time, it is a very, very high-paid, self-protective bureaucracy. And what I think the reformist who lost his seat on the Port Commission last fall and those who were the insurgents that were seeking seats discovered is the old principle that was once stated by Tom Wicker of the New York Times: hell hath no fury like a bureaucracy defending itself.
Well, let's actually go to the Weekly article if we could. Let's get that up. And in the Weekly article itself, I mean, there you are, big picture of Mick Dinsmore, $273,000 salary. Is there a higher paid public official besides the football coach, of course, in Washington?
Possibly not. And you know, he may be worth that. I mean, they're in for tens of millions of dollars in King County property tax money. It's a huge economic engine. It's very crucial to the local economy.
Just at the same point in time, the Port of Seattle is the highest publicly subsidized port in all of North America.
Well, I didn't know that. It doesn't surprise me, but and that's one thing that some of the reformers wanted to do was to reduce the tax contribution.
Not only highly subsidized, also high-handed. For instance, the machinations that the port has gone to spy on one of its great critics, Pete Knutson, the fisherman out of Fisherman's Terminal, who has committed the sin of selling smoked salmon, apparently from his boat. But the surveillance directed at him and so forth. If you use the Public Disclosure Act and get all of the paper on this and all the memos going around and so on, again, it is a situation where they're kind of freaked out that people criticize them, and port commissioners are supposed to go on trade trips and otherwise, I suppose, go along with what management wants.
And to get back to your initial question about is there a big change in store, I'm probably a hopeless Boy Scout where I think things ought to be all above board and transparent, and every so often we'll do a story like this that suggests that an institution is not performing the way it should in the open, and probably our story isn't going to result in much because nobody cares about the port, and I think that that's frustrating.
But it's a huge economic engine. Joel's over there smiling. Nobody cares about the port.
Oh, I am reminded of a wonderful story out of Chicago politics, where the newspapers had, both the Sun-Times and the Tribune, had been going after various corruption and various nepotism and so on in the Chicago Democratic machine. Along came an election for alderman, and all the machine people got back in. And there was one old rogue on the board of aldermen, Patty Baller, who owned a tavern on the south side and who spent the evening of the election shouting obscenities at reporters and finally uttered the immortal word, "Chicago ain't ready for reform." I think you can maybe say that for the port too.
Well, let's go see if the Weekly has topped the Sun-Times and the Tribune. Let's go to the first part here. This is straight from the article on July the 8th, 2005. Wallace, that was Bob Wallace, sent Dinsmore an email that the Weekly obtained through the Open Records Act. It reads that Frank concurs somewhat skeptically with the decision to spend the $15,000 on research. Hopefully they'll do a good job. Wallace and Dinsmore confirm that the email refers to $15,000 in donations that the PAC planned to give to the Pat Davis campaign to do polling for her re-election bid. And Pat Davis, of course, is a very big supporter of Mick Dinsmore.
Mick Dinsmore should not be messing around with campaign polling. I mean, this election decides who his bosses will be. And the other frustrating thing about this story, besides the fact that I'm, at least cynically right now, not expecting much to come from this.
You don't even get a badge for this, Boy Scout.
Yeah. That Pat Davis, all these guys, all these folks don't get it. They really don't. They don't see anything wrong with this.
Well, let's go back to that article again, and we can just click on the next thing because we see Alec Fiskin, one of the reformers. He claims that businesses that funded Wallace's PAC and Davis's campaign are getting huge public subsidies in the amount of $120 million. Now, all of a sudden, it ought to matter. That's a lot of money.
Right, and you can debate that particular amount in those projects. And I guess I don't get so hung up on the dollar amount and whether it's big or not. I just think on principle, it ought to be all above board. The CEO waits for the outcome of the election, and he's at their beck and call when whoever the five are on the Port Commission.
Well, we're talking about caring a lot tonight. Joel, why don't people care about this?
I don't think they recognize the importance of the port. And remember that, say back in New York, the great builder Robert Moses, basically acquired his individual taxing authority through the Triborough Bridge Authority. That Moses decided, what to do with all of the money from all of the tolls coming into New York City and so forth. And he had to propose to build a freeway across Lower Manhattan, right through Greenwich Village, among other places, and so on, before a famous urbanologist named Jane Jacobs led the opposition to this and finally stopped him. But Moses was essentially in business, creating his own tax authority and dominating its boards and so on, from the time that Al Smith was the governor of New York back in the 20s all the way into the 1960s. So these quasi-government authorities, except when there is a great explosion like the Washington Public Power Supply System,
or the third runway,
or the third runway, and so on, do not generate a great deal of alarm. And what you want is a board, a board full of people that will take an annual junket to trade trip to the Orient and an annual junket to the River Spree or the River Danube or the Moldau in Europe to examine the trade practices of European cities.
And the thing is that the port is an amazing. This is huge. Seattle is so well positioned, and the port is so important, and people don't get that. And part of it is the media's fault. We're trying to do more in writing.
So is this behind.
It's it's as important as having Boeing around. I mean, it maybe more.
Well, let's see if we can raise your hackles even more. Let's go back to the article from the Seattle Weekly, because it's talking
drives
about
me crazy.
Earlier in 2005, Dinsmore exchanged emails with Jim Dwyer, now the CEO of Washington Dental Service and formerly the CEO of the port. May 17, 2005, Dwyer informed Dinsmore that Jack Jolly, was going to run against Davis in the upcoming election. Dinsmore replied, "Not a bad guy, but he needs to get off the kick that he may run against Pat." Dwyer inquired who was running for the open seat, and Dinsmore replied, "We have a few heavies we are working with. I will call soon and solicit your political clout to help." That is a great big red flag that says to me, I am going to get somebody who I want to run.
They were just kidding around.
Yeah?
That's their explanation.
Really?
Yeah. At the same time, however, Pat Davis is somebody 20 years ago. She was a reformer. She was with Port Watch when she was elected, and now is the, the leading defender of the status quo, the leading defender of the tax subsidy, and so on. Somebody who has, I believed, cost us up to $5,000 or $5,400 to be precise, and airfare on trips to Europe.
Yeah, but studying the trade practices of inter-city or inter-European,
Barcelona, Budapest, and Berlin.
Right.
It's important for her to experience business class.
The three B's. But it is a situation. That's been another aspect of the port, is like an invasion of the body snatchers aspect to this outfit, namely that they turn yesterday's reformers and yesterday's civic activists into tomorrow's defenders. And again, there are all of the perks if you go along, and of course if you do not go along, like Lawrence Malloy, whose defeat that they were planning, you are ostracized. You get charged with various things, and ultimately you get outspent and defeated by the local establishment.
I think it's probably the frequent flyer miles ultimately that tips them over to the dark side.
Well, I mean, to be a port commissioner, you get paid roughly, is it $8,000 or $10,000?
Yeah,
it's
nothing.
a tiny amount.
Yeah.
It is the perks. It is the perks. But now Dinsmore's contract runs out soon, doesn't it?
End of 2007 or something like that.
So is he going to fade into retirement? Is he going to make it to the end of his contract?
I don't know. I wouldn't bet against it.
I would bet that there is a very carefully organized passing of the torch to somebody that he approves of, and that in a way is what this election last year was about.
So there's still not enough reformers. I mean, I think Fiskin clearly is.
It's a 3-2 situation.
Lloyd Harrah is
still
known as a reformer.
Well, he's not necessarily a reformer.
His body hasn't been snatched yet.
He's a skeptic.
Okay.
But he's
a
not
skeptic who wants to travel.
Yeah, that's.
Well, he went to Asia.
Yeah, I mean, Lloyd Harrah is a skeptic who will ask tough questions and is probably his own man, but he's not an earnest reformer in the sense that Alex.
Where's Jack Creighton right now?
Well, he was in Melbourne with the economic development
That wasn't what I meant.
a little bit earlier this spring.
Never mind. Don't need to ask that question.
Anyway, it's 3-2 now in people who can be who reliably support the Dinsmore management style.
Well, let me take a little bit of a leap here. If there were reform, what would reform look like? Would we have an airport that is getting more people in? It seems pretty crowded to me. Would we have a seaport that is becoming more competitive on the West Coast?
That's a good question. I think environmental impact is one thing that and less and more interest in creating actual jobs. And I mean, they called it the Blue-Green Alliance because it was blue collar, green environmental. It's the loosely organized movement.
That was a PAC. That was the Wallace PAC, right? Or was that the other side?
No, that was the other side.
The other side? Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, the Wallace PAC was he and Dinsmore were communicating about something. So I think that in the crudest terms, it's getting rid of the old boy way of doing business.
Well, okay, as a taxpayer, if it is successful for us, now while, and I don't define success as being the highest subsidy, publicly subsidized port in North America, but if it is successful on an economic standpoint, why would I want to get rid of the good old boys?
Well, because 70 million, is it 70 million or something a year in King County tax money? I mean, the subsidy, I mean, it's hard to tell how, I mean, shouldn't they be doing that without a subsidy? I mean, why?
Yeah, not only the subsidy, but also the boys are kind of atrophied in the way they do things. One of the bees in Jack Jolly's bonnet in the campaign last year was how we could make the port more friendly to the export of Washington wine, which is now, some of which is world famous, and a great deal of which is going to other ports, and was proposing extended hours and just different ways of doing things that nobody had thought of in terms of getting another product going out of the port. And I think when you have an atrophied ruling class, you don't have new people, and you don't have new ideas.
The other thing is that the present track is geared toward developing a lot of the waterfront property that the port has, and I think some of the reformers felt like, that's not, real estate is not the mission here, and once you sell that property, you've lost waterfront, it's gone. There's no ongoing revenue stream from that.
All right, let's take a real short break. Just want to remind everyone we're talking with Joel Connelly of the Seattle PI, longtime columnist and just an excellent writer for the PI. Read his columns, I think Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and other times as well. Pick up the paper or read it at www.seattlepi.com. Chuck Taylor is the boss at the Seattle Weekly.
Well, not the boss, no. Number two.
He's the number 2 guy at the Seattle Weekly. He helps make it, it's doing even more investigative journalism, and I definitely applaud the Seattle Weekly for doing that. Pick it up every week on many, many stands around the area, or pick it up online, seattleweekly.com. The Seattle Weekly wrote an article entitled "A Big Ugly Ethics Violation," and it was about a video that was done.
The mayor gave a speech to the downtown Rotary about the viaduct, and of course the mayor would like to replace the viaduct with a cut and cover tunnel at far more expense than it would cost to replace the viaduct itself. And for this speech, he had the Seattle Channel, which is a city hall department, create a parody video about a supposed campaign group that wanted to save the big ugly things like the viaduct.
Yeah, and if we could, let's get that the picture back up if we could from the article, because I wish we could play the video, but it's in a file that we can't get. But the parody is Committee to Save Big Ugly Things. And in watching the video, Joel, I don't know if you've had a chance to see it, but the entire focus is that we should build a tunnel instead of the viaduct because the viaduct is ugly.
That's the ultimate message, yeah.
Now, while it was a parody, of course, in jest, there's lots of truth. Is that really, when you get right down to it, why Mayor Nichols wants to tear down the viaduct?
I think we're in a situation where Seattle mayors get elected on promising to bring more public safety to the streets of Columbia City and to fix potholes and various things. But sooner or later they get overcome by the urban vision thing, as George Bush Sr. might call it, and again want major. They're kind of like presidents of France. They want major showpiece, but they want to put a major showpiece in the city before they go.
Perhaps without the mistresses.
And beyond that, to be able to take the showpiece and give urban vision speeches in every place except the city of which you're mayor. And I think Nichols, with the tunnel, with the $1.8 billion fixing program, is into this. He's going to be going up and touting our global warming program at the United Nations World Urban Forum in Vancouver later on in the month. So, again, Nichols has kind of gotten into this President of the Republic grandiosity, I think, and is also, however, having hell's own time trying to sell it. His people trying to sell it to focus groups and trying to hammer out to use the Bush phrase, strategery, to win an advisory election should we have one in November.
Well, Chuck, so while the Weekly was doing the article about the Big Ugly ethics violation and really...
And we were questioning the use of the city channel to create essentially what we think is a campaign tool.
And then Joel wrote this article, and the headline of it is all roads lead to one big viaduct mess, and that's for sure. And when we get to the article, you're going to see there's, that's apparently is the viaduct mess that they're wanting to replace. And in the article itself, talk about as Mayor Greg Nichols, poll takers are finding out, testing the themes to sell the viaduct tunnel to the voters, out-of-towners get more delight out of the downtown waterfront than do most locals. How can one pledge to reconnect the city and its waterfront have appeal when the connection is frayed to begin with? Will the promise of a green promenade have appeal when we leave the place to tourists? Is that what this is about?
It's also about, first of all, West Seattle's continued connection with the rest of the city, as well as places south of West Seattle. Secondly, it's about, to a considerable extent, the maintenance of what working waterfront we have left. The 34th District Democrats had an interesting forum on this, in which the guy who's the head of Ballard Oil came, and he basically supplies fishing boats north of the ship canal, but at the same time has to go to Harbor Island to get his oil supply. And if there's no viaduct, or if there's a beautiful boulevard with trees growing up and this type of thing, it'll be cheaper for him to go all the way up to the refinery in Anacortes to get the oil than it would be to try to get down to Harbor Island and back. So there's, to a considerable extent, it is whether we still want a working waterfront, and also, how frayed and for how long we want the connection between a neighborhood with, 85,000 people in West Seattle, to, how long we want that to be frayed.
I have to confess, I think that we've got to have some kind of transportation solution on the waterfront. I don't know how I feel about which one it is, but there is an interesting point being made by the folks, the People's Waterfront Coalition, that is pushing the idea of tear it down, improve Alaskan Way, and step back and see what happens. Maybe add more transit. And we're going to have to do that anyway while they rebuild this thing. And Carrie Moon, who's the head of that group, made an interesting point. I can't remember in whose publication. I guess it was ours. That everything's a blur. People adjust, and for a number of years, they're going to have to live without the viaduct. And so,
people adjust.
No,
there's a generation of businesses that would go under without.
Yeah, but what are they
going
to do for 5 years while they can't?
They're going
use
to go under or go somewhere else.
There's an awful lot of kind of smoke and mirrors. There are 15% of trips that are not necessary that won't be taken.
Well,
and this sort of thing.
Right, yeah.
Comparison of Seattle's waterfront freeway, which actually does lead from one place to another, to the old Embarcadero in San Francisco, which did not connect the Bay Bridge with the Golden Gate. And also, again, all of these artist depictions of, tree-lined boulevards and people sipping lattes and so on, which is exactly like the depictions of a bus-free 3rd Avenue that we were getting 20 years ago from advocates of the downtown Seattle bus tunnel.
All right, your turn.
Well, I just think it's interesting. I mean, I think that it's ironic that we're not going to find out if that kind of hands-off approach would work until we decide on.
But there's a way we can do that. And what you do is you just wait a day when you close the Battery Street Tunnel. That's all you need to do. And then try to get to 405. Try to drive on 405. That's how much impact it has, because I've been there. It's amazing what happens when the Alaskan Way Viaduct is closed.
Okay, so again,
retrofit.
While it's being torn down and rebuilt or whatever, it's going to be years. But we'll have to do without.
What's the principle with doctors? First, do no harm.
Right.
I think there should also be something, and we can take a lesson from the bus one. First, with major urban transportation projects, first minimize harm, particularly to the businesses and to the people whose livelihoods are at stake there. That's of course something we did not do with 3rd Avenue when we built the bus tunnel. But I think I can hardly think that a waterfront tunnel is a way of minimizing harm. or minimizing dislocation.
Could be. We'll be finding out here, but I don't think we're going to find out anytime soon.
No.
All right, now let's go to something else. And when you look at this next picture, just see if it's an accurate depiction. Here is Ollie and Fraser, but the Ollie and Fraser of today in Seattle could very well be
Ollie and Liston, isn't it?
Okay, Ollie and Liston. Yeah, sorry. Ollie's beating up somebody.
I'm going to want that big ugly bear.
There is the PI in the Times. And the big question is, Chuck, you having worked for the Times, Joel, you working for the PI now, is the race between the dailies, is it over? Is there going to be a race? Will there be 2 dailies? And then we're going to get into your article, Joel.
Nobody knows how the arbitration is going to go. The Hearst Council has tried to convince people in our building that the PI has a fighting chance in it.
I continue to believe that the only question is who will end up owning the Seattle Times. And I think the PI will get closed at some point. I just don't see how it can be avoided. But I would prefer we have 2 newspapers. I think the PI ought to look at going web only. I think that web advertising now is robust enough that you could make a go of it. You don't have a lot of overhead with the web. You don't have to print papers and truck them around.
Well, let's go to Joel's article then. The headline is The Race Between the Dailies, and it digs up news. And great question in the article. Amid declining circulation but rising online readership, your point, Chuck, newspapers across the country have lately been sold, shut down in a few cases, and engaged in a frenzy of self-examination. And here's the great question. Why should the readers care? That's my question to you. Why should the readers care?
Well, in this city, both papers make a worthy, and you pointed this out, I think, make a worthy contribution to the public discourse by going after different stories, competing. I mean, I used to work on the Metro desk at the Times at night when we were an afternoon paper, and the PI would come up from the press room at about 11, and the first thing we did was go through and find out, you know, whether we got beat on anything. And then if we did get beat on something, I had to roll somebody out of bed, some politician out of bed, and match the story for the next day's paper. And that's healthy.
We beat the Times on the web by I think 10 minutes on the killing of Zarqawi in Iraq, and there's enormous pride about that in the newsroom. But the serious point is competition makes you do the job better, and I think that that having 2 daily newspapers with 2 strong managing editors and so on is something that keeps the big boys, and I guess we're talking about Pat Davises and the big girls honest, and has served this city well, and never better than, say, on Hanford and things, when both newspapers were fully engaged and highly competitive.
Well, that's got to be the last word. Joel did say that competition makes us better, but the truth of the matter is there's just no competition for Joel Connelly and Chuck Taylor right here on Public Exposure, and we'll see you next week.